Okay, we're recording and welcome everyone to the 2023 4-day regression modeling strategies course. I'm thrilled that you're here, and I'm here with my partner, Drew Levy, who has worked with me on this course for many years. And it's really great to work with Drew because me being a biostatistician and him being an epidemiologist, I think we complement each other a lot. And so Drew will be coordinating and moderating, and he also will be presenting a section of the course related to causal inference. So I'm so glad that we have a great turnout this year. We have about 98 in all, and some of them are in far time zones, which I really appreciate, but some of them will be attending part of the course during a reasonable daylight hours and watching videos to complete what they missed on a given day. It appears that it takes a total of about 2 hours to process the videos at the end of each day before I get them on YouTube so that you can get a link to view them at your leisure. So the goal is to have the videos ready about 2 hours after we complete each day's course. Those of you who have not signed in yet on the Google Sheet, please do. And in looking over those that have signed in so far, which was about 2/3 of the group, I see a lot of great fields represented and places represented. And many of you are in clinical and patient-oriented and health research and health outcomes research, which is really the area that Drew and I work in a lot. So our examples will be familiar to you. And those of you who are not in the health field, the examples, most of the examples are in the health field, but the methods are really go beyond that. So the methods that we cover work in business, they work in marketing, they work in economics and sociology, and you name it. Anytime you have lots of variables and you want to learn about relationships of variables and maybe make predictions, it's going to apply. So I'm a professor of biostatistics at Vanderbilt University, which is a private university in Nashville, Tennessee, USA. And I've been there since 2003, but my career has been really in clinical biostatistics, especially in clinical trials. I also work part-time for the FDA, where I get exposed to a lot of really great clinical trials ideas and see what's going on in the pharmaceutical industry. My main areas of expertise are predictive modeling, statistical modeling in general, Bayesian modeling, statistical graphics, computing, model validation, and measuring performance of models. Drew, you want to introduce yourself?
Sure, Frank. My name is Drew Levy. I'm speaking to you from Sonoma, California. My background, my training is in epidemiology, and I've worked in the pharmaceutical industry for a long while, primarily in medical affairs and in sort of post-marketing research. My particular areas of interest are modern applied methods for observational data analysis, now especially in the rare disease space, and causal inference and causal inference. But I think my best qualification is that I've been taking Frank's course now for maybe 15 years. That both indicates that I'm a very slow learner, but that also that every year there's something new to be gained and learned from returning. And so it's a privilege to get to hear Frank speak on regression modeling strategies year after year after year and improve my understanding. So my qualification is that I understand where things are often difficult as a student to learn or understand or appreciate or apprehend. And so I'm here to help you with that. Where you get stuck or where things are confusing, catch me on the chat, ask questions, don't be shy. As Richard McElreath, another famous statistician, likes to say, if you're confused, it's because you're paying attention. So please ask questions and let me help you.
Well said, Drew. And I want to emphasize how throughout the course of the year, Drew and I worked together, and Drew is always coming up with suggestions for making the course better. And he's also in tune with what the participants are experiencing to help make the course better. So I always appreciate Drew's involvement. And so I just got an email from one of the participants who is off an hour. So I hope he gets the time straight. Okay. So Drew, do you want to say a few words about how best to handle interactions and questions? Any thoughts you have?
Yeah. Now, again, I want to emphasize that Frank has a lot to say, and in fact, there's so much really, important stuff that's going to come out of his mouth. I like paying attention to it. I like the didactic, but Frank has heard himself talk, in this forum for so long. He really likes the interaction. He really likes questions. He really likes it if this didactic is broken up with engagement with you guys. So don't be shy about asking questions. If though he's on a roll and you don't want to interrupt the narrative, we've always had a very vigorous sort of exchange going on in the chat bar, and we will keep the chat bar, and it exists in perpetuity for you to access as well and see some of the answers given there. So I encourage people to post questions in the chat bar. We'll also, Frank will explain how datamethods.org is used to capture really the questions that need more time and space for detailed answers and more careful consideration. But raise your hand, speak up, ask questions, put questions in the chat bar, send me emails later or Frank emails later, and then consider datamethods.org for those larger, heavier, weightier, more complex queries.
Thanks, Drew. And we really do want to encourage interaction, because listening to one person talk all the time is ultimately very boring. And I really love to have discussion even about very controversial things related to what we're talking about in statistics. So please feel free to make this course as interactive as we can, and there'll be plenty of time for questions. I want to start sharing the screen here, so you can see our homepage for this course, and you can see the maps showing where you all are from. So this is our representation within the US, where we see some areas with a large number of people from those areas. And then in the world map, we have participants from lots of different countries going very far east of here. And so, and usually, as usual, we have a good many from Europe, and also Canada is always represented. So the course has this schedule. So we're in the 4-day course here. So this is Chicago time or Nashville time, Central time in the US. We go from 9 to 12 and 1 to 4 for 3 days. And then the last day, we might go till 2, but current plan is to go till 1 o'clock. And then we may go to 1, but not have a lunch break on that day. These other days, we will have a 1-hour break in the middle, and we'll also have about 10 to 15 minute breaks at each hour and a half. So we'll take a short break at 10:30 today. So that's the plan. And then, like I said, the videos will be available to you very soon. And I do want to mention data methods that Drew mentioned. This is our discussion board for really in-depth discussions that go beyond just simple questions. And this could also be debates. And we have a lot of debates going on data methods. This is the biggest debate we've ever had. Should one derive risk difference from the odds ratio? So this is something that epidemiologists are especially interested in. So we've had 562 replies to the original message. And so these replies just go on and on and on, and they're led by Sander Greenland, who is an extremely knowledgeable quantitative epidemiologist. And that's received 42,000 views, this page. But you can see the topics are very varied. Validation and calibration of clinical prediction model using Kaplan-Meier estimated survival, capturing daily patterns and step counts, analyzing two different groups of subjects, does including time to event or censoring and logistic regression model cause collider bias. So there's a huge variety of subjects, but if you go to datamethods.org/RMS, you'll get to the navigation page for questions related to this course. And you can see that these are laid out in the chapters that are in the textbook, as well as the chapter numbers in the notes that we'll be using in the course. And so when you have a question about a specific topic area, go to the chapter that it's in. And so if you go to the chapter 2, general aspects of fitting regression models, you'll see a little bit of an overview, and then you'll see some questions that people have. Somebody please mute their microphone. Thanks. And so this is an archive of questions from the course 2 years ago. You might get something out of look at these excellent questions, and then people ask other questions later. So the reason I'm showing you this datamethods.org, it's a way to make the course more valuable, so that I think there's still someone that has their microphone unmuted.
I've got it.
Thanks. Having this discussion board is a way to make the course more valuable after it's over. And also between our sessions, if you have a course and the chat is not active because the session's not active, you can bring questions to the correct chapter in this data methods site. And so a lot of you have signed up for this already, and I see there's some new signups that I haven't approved yet, but I'll be getting to that probably at the break. So does anybody have any question about the role of datamethods.org? So I think you'll find it's quite a good knowledge repository and a place to ask questions. It's intended to be a place where methodologists and subject matter researchers get together. So say somebody doing clinical trials who's a clinical investigator has some question about clinical trial design or analysis. And so a bunch of methodologists will help with questions like that. So we have a lot of great people answering questions on the site worldwide.
It's sort of like Stack Exchange for your methodologic problems.
Right. And that does bring up stats.stackexchange.com, which is the most popular site in the world for statistics and machine learning questions. And so the number of questions that are here is really amazing. Some of them are very basic, some of them are very advanced, but a lot of the questions get answered by some very knowledgeable people. So this is for general statistics questions, ones that are not directly related to the course. But you'll find this site is incredibly valuable. So this is a companion site to stackoverflow.com, which is the most popular website in the world for asking programming questions. And on stackoverflow.com, if you look at the questions about the R language, there's about 450,000 questions on it about R. You get amazing help with that. So if you have an R question, that's really a great place to ask it when you tag the question with a lowercase r as a tag. So that was stackoverflow.com, and this is stats.stackexchange.com. So the resources that are out there are kind of amazing once you know where to find them. And we're also trying to use datamethods.org for crowdsourcing certain questions. So some clinical trials and other study investigators are trying to design a study. and sometimes are just not ashamed to ask for help and will actually crowdsource the design and get a lot of great input on datamethods.org.
Cheeto, do you have you've had your hand up for a bit.
Yes. Actually, I first my first encounter with Frank was through the Stack Exchange, and so yeah, I had some questions, and he basically explained to me that my questions were fundamentally wrong, and that got it into just like how to evaluate classification models, and that got me intrigued, and that's how I ended up eventually in this course. So I use stats.stack exchange quite a lot. My question is, practically, what is the difference between that and datamethods.org? So if I have a statistics question, which one do you think would be more appropriate in which situation for me to ask my question on?
Great question. So, and I'm glad that got you into this course. The questions about the RMS package in R that we'll be using for the case studies would go to datamethods.org/RMS and just stay on that page. Don't use the navigation at the top, which gets you into the chapters, but just stay on that page and go to the bottom and ask a question. Question about things that are directly related to this course, especially about splines and model validation and a few other things, are probably best on datamethods.org in the right chapter. If it's a general question, then stats.stackexchange.com is usually better, and you'll get more responses about general statistics questions and machine learning. The one thing about stats.stackexchange.com that made me create data methods is stats.stackexchange does not allow discussion. They will kick you off of the topic if you start discussing things rather than asking questions and giving answers. So it's strictly a question and answer site. And they have pretty tight controls on that, whereas data methods is intended to be discourse in general. So it could be question and answer, could be debate, it could be extended discussion about some answer or question. So that extended discussion is not allowed on stats.stackexchange.com. So they both definitely have a role. In terms of the sort of questions that are best for asking during the 4 days that we're together, there's all kinds of questions that would be great for you to ask. And the only type of question we probably don't have time for is if you ask a question that needs a lot of setup. So if you need to get into a specific data set or a specific study design to give background for a question, that's not going to be so interesting to the other folks. So something that requires specifics to a given project that you're working on might be really good for datamethods.org, but not necessarily for a question during our session. So the question should really be about methods and about how to apply methods, when to apply methods, and what are they doing? How do they work? Those sort of questions, rather than getting into a specific need you have for a project where you have to take 2 minutes describing it before you get to the question. Those are probably best to hold off on those. But other than that, we want to hear a lot of questions. Let's see if there's any other logistical things I need to mention. I think I'll mention a few things when I get into the course notes. So if this will be our main resource for the course, this is an electronic book, and I've converted all of my materials to Quarto, which is a revolutionary way to compose things in general, because Quarto provides a single way to do things, whether you're doing an article, a book, a blog, or a website. So it's all Quarto. So you don't have to keep using different tools and different packages. And the features are really terrific. So that's how these things were composed. And so this is the preface as we go to the notes, which are at hbiostat.org/RMSC. And let me just enlarge this a little. So there's some background information and what are the learning goals. And so we want to be able to fit multivariable regression models accurately. And we want to do it within the confines of the sample size. This is a key point that comes up over and over in the course, is if you are running a household and you live beyond your means, you always get into trouble. So having a budget, financial budget, is a key thing about running a household. And it's the same way with analyzing data. There's a certain budget you need to live within, and that budget is dictated by your sample size. And so if you go outside the sample size, you can expect bad things to happen when you overspend. For example, in genetics, if you have 100 patients and you're analyzing 10,000 genes, you can pretty much expect a disaster. You can expect to get a paper published because there's always a journal out there for you if you look hard enough. But getting the paper published doesn't mean that the results are actually any good. So the probability that the results you find on 100 patients analyzing a million features or 100,000 features or 20,000 genes, the probability that that result will replicate is virtually zero. You're living so far outside your sample size that you're just finding noise, and much more noise than signal. And so that theme will come up over and over in the course, because I learned early on that when you go outside your budget, you just have unreliability in your results. And you might get something that's fun to do, but if it's ultimately going to result in a letter to the editor or a retraction or whatever, that's not so much fun. We do modeling to uncover complex relationships. We do modeling to test for and quantify association between some predictors and some outcome or response variable, adjusting for other things. We do modeling to make maximum use of partial data. So rather than deleting records that have some missing values in some of the variables, we want to make use of all of the available data because that works a lot better. So that gets into missing data imputation. We want to be able to validate models and understand problems caused by overfitting to detect. We want to detect overfitting. And then this phrase, safe data mining, describes some of what we're doing. So we want to be able to mine data, but we want to do it in a safe way so that we're not learning noise, we're learning signal. And we want the measures that we compute to have the properties that we claim, such as confidence interval coverage. We want to interpret models, learn about the advantages of semi-parametric ordinal models. So that's a emphasis in the course. And I hope to convince you why that is emphasized so much. Learn about some differences between frequent descent Bayesian approaches to modeling and differences between machine learning and statistical models, and how to determine which of the two approaches might be better for your particular project. Then there's a philosophy for the course. It's good to have a philosophy that you're willing to put in print, and you might do this as a personal exercise. What's your own philosophy about learning or data or analysis or anything? Because by putting a philosophy down in print and letting other people see it, they'll give you some ideas for how to fill in some gaps in your philosophy. Modeling is the endeavor to transform data into information and information to either prediction or evidence about the data generating mechanism. So that's really the central idea about statistical modeling. And it happens that models are the best descriptive statistics. We'll see that in a variety of examples where people are used to doing things like calculating proportions or calculating stratified means. And those are ultimately failing. So we think of descriptive statistics as a very wonderful thing to do, but it turns out they're not very descriptive most of the time because they can only look at 2 or 3 variables at a time. So to really have a great description, a model is much more valuable than just basic descriptive statistics. And it doesn't have to be a model in the formal sense. It could be machine learning. It could be things like moving averages. Descriptive statistics do not work in higher dimension. That's the real problem. If you make your model assumptions better, things will work better. So you'll have better statistical power, you'll have better precision, and you need to be aware of the assumptions you're making, especially the assumptions that matter the most. So the assumption that matters the most, that it's the most frequently violated in my career, has been the assumption of linearity of effects. Things just are not linear very often. And when you assume they're linear, you get wrong answers, or you get an answer that's really suboptimal. We like to make models fit step by step. So part of the process of modeling is to estimate transformations of the predictor variables. We don't want transformations to be a game where you try different things and then you use something that seems to work, because it's very hard to incorporate uncertainties in that process. Your confidence intervals will not be correct when you do that. So if you don't know how something should be transformed, that should be part of the process, is to estimate that transformation and to have more parameters involved. Now, a lot of courses are taught with a heavy emphasis on model diagnostics. I was liking that for a couple of decades, and I've really gotten turned off by that, because I've just finally seen the light that when we run model diagnostics, the interpretation of those is too subjective. We can make most anything we want out of those diagnostics depending on how tired we are. If we're tired, the diagnostics look better than if we have a lot of energy early in the day. And so the diagnostics are often not objective, and they're often not actionable. And if you change the model in reaction to observed patterns, you're going to increase model uncertainty. It looks like you're decreasing uncertainty, but you're actually increasing uncertainty, and your standard errors are going to be wrong. Graphical methods are very important, but they work better when you combine them with formal things. Overfitting is one of our biggest enemies in analyzing data, and you could also call that overinterpretation. So we need to learn about data reduction and model validation. Software without multiple facilities may only seem to be user-friendly. So there's a lot of people trying to do statistical analysis with SPSS and other menu-driven systems. It's ultimately very unsatisfying, because you get to the point after using the system a few days where there's something not on the menu. And you also decide that you want everything you do to be reproducible. You want to be able to run one command and reproduce an entire book, which is something I do all the time. So if your software is fully scripted, you can do everything in a reproducible fashion, which also is very kind to yourself, because you don't have to remember how you got an answer, what menu did you select. So if something is very user-friendly, it's usually a bad idea. User-friendliness in the simple notion of user-friendly usually means limiting. And we really don't want to be limited. In fitting an improper model can be better than badly fitting a well-chosen model. So I see some statisticians agonize over the choice of the model and then do everything wrong. So if you agonize over a survival model and you fit a certain parametric survival model, like a Weibull distribution, and you are really sure that that fits your data generating mechanism well, but you have 30 events and you fit a model with 20 variables in it, it doesn't matter that it was a well-chosen model or not. Okay. Methods that work for all types of models are preferred. So the methods that we'll be learning in the course are very, very general. So once you learn them, they'll apply to longitudinal data, time to event data, all kinds of data. The cost of data collection far outweighs the cost of data analysis. So it's important to use efficient and accurate modeling techniques to avoid throwing away information, to not remove data from the estimation sample just to be able to validate a model. And so I like to say that a $100 analysis can make $1 million study worthless. This sounds like an exaggeration, but I've seen many studies that cost way more than $1 million to do, that the statistical analysis provided no information about the question that was actually the question of interest. It's amazing that this happens. It's a tragedy when it happens, but it happens pretty often. So you'll see studies of, say, weight loss, where the conclusion of the study that patients who lost weight have better health outcomes. And because they had a very simple analysis, they got the wrong answer. And the right answer, if you reanalyze the data, was that before you start the follow-up for health outcomes, your current weight was predictive of outcomes, and it's irrelevant whether you lost weight or not. So by analyzing the data more carefully, you get the right answer. And by just doing a simple analysis like weight change versus risk of heart attack, you actually get the wrong answer. The bootstrap is a breakthrough, especially for model validation, and Bayesian modeling is now ready for prime time, partially because we now have computational tools that are amazing that we did not used to have for Bayesian modeling. So with Bayesian modeling, you can incorporate non-data knowledge, and that's a big deal. So one thing that Andrew Gelman writes about is traditional ways of analyzing data has a pretty big chance of getting the wrong direction of an effect, what he calls the type S error, which is a sign error. So if you get the sign of the regression coefficient wrong, so you say that smoking is good for you when it's really bad for you, that's a pretty big error. And when you don't use any outside knowledge at all in your modeling, you have a bigger chance of getting a type S error than you do when you're using prior information that's valid. Bayesian methods also allow you to do penalized regression and get full inferential tools. We do penalized regression a lot in the frequentist world, but we don't really have that many inferential tools once you do penalization. It's all kind of an approximate thing, and getting confidence intervals is not easy. Bayes gives you a rational way to account for model uncertainty. It gives you direct evidence for all possible values of a regression coefficient. So in the frequentist world, we frequently say, do we have evidence against the assumption that beta is 0? So the p-value is a measure of surprise. It's a measure of how embarrassing the data are to the null hypothesis. So if you assume the null hypothesis is true, do you find something embarrassing, something that would refute the null hypothesis? So that's evidence against a value of beta. But in decision-making, what you need is not evidence against something, but you need evidence in favor of something. Does this drug have an effect of reducing your blood pressure 5 millimeters of mercury or more? What's the evidence in favor of that assertion? And contrast that with the evidence against the assertion that the treatment does not change the blood pressure. Bayes also gives you a more accurate way to deal with missing data. And then whether you're using Bayesian or frequentist methods, using the data to guide the data analysis is almost as dangerous as not doing so. So this is a very strange looking comment. If you pre-specify a model and you pre-specified it incorrectly and you ignore some obvious problems with the fit of the model, you can get a bad answer. If you look at the data and you keep fixing the model, you'll actually make the model better than it really is. And your standard errors will not work, and your confidence intervals will not work, p-values will not work. So there's kind of a fine line between using the data to change how you analyze the data versus pre-specifying everything. We're going to try to walk that tightrope in this course, but it is a tightrope that's hard to walk. A good strategy is to decide how many parameters you can estimate using your sample size. The number of parameters you can estimate is the same as saying how many degrees of freedom do you have in the model. we're going to estimate parameters. In other words, your spending degrees of freedom. You have to decide where to devote the parameters. Are you going to devote the parameters for linear effects, nonlinear effects, interactions? And then you estimate the parameters without regrets. So that is our global strategy for this course. This has to do with parameter budgeting, which is living within your sample size. And then fitting a model. And if you get some non-significant results in the model, that means you're doing it correctly. Getting p-value greater than 0.05 is a good thing. And if you resist the temptation to remove that variable from the model, you are doing a good thing. So that's something we'll visit many times during this course. Now, this is a link that you can click on to learn more about how to ask questions directly in the text of the electronic book or to highlight things. So this is using a really wonderful system called Hypothesis. And you see somebody who was in the class highlighted that one there. And so if you ask questions or you annotate or you have a better explanation for something than I explained here, there'll be a little symbol that comes up and you can click and that'll pop up in the margin. And so when you're using Hypothesis, you can have personal annotations and comments, questions and answers, or you can have public ones like these were. So public ones other people would see, and personal ones are just for your own use that don't show. The amazing thing about this system, Hypothesis, is that when the electronic book changes, the annotations that you add will go with the changes. So it's actually doing a lot of character recognition so that if you insert a new paragraph here, this annotation will move down to the right place. I've been waiting for a long time for somebody to develop a system like that, and they finally did. There's some stuff here about symbols and then some of the other resources. Discussion board, we already talked about. There is another course called Biostatistics and Biomedical Research that has an online ebook that's about 500 pages. That's for general statistics. And it's heavily related to clinical trials and biomedical research, but it has a lot of general statistics in it too. There is a compilation of statistical papers written for non-statisticians. You can get to those here. There's some great papers. There is the blog Statistical Thinking that I have, and this has a lot of articles related to this course. There is a little newspaper, and then there's a glossary of statistical terms. And if there's a term that we throw around without defining it, and it's not in that glossary, please write me, and I will add a definition into that glossary. Then there is another electronic book that's fairly new called R Workflow, and this is intended to be a lifelong way to use R. So this is for an entire R workflow, going from the simplest problems to the most complex problems in data manipulation and longitudinal data and statistical reporting and a lot more. How to do simulations, how to do advanced tables and graphics and all kinds of things. So you may want to look at that for things that are related to R. There's a lot of material in there. Any questions about the philosophy of the course or the overall guiding principle of the course? So there's a good question in the chat. What happens when model assumptions are violated? What's the thought process that goes on into validating it? And so I think the theme on that's evolved over the years in my own brain has been that the idea of validating assumptions or not validating assumptions is not so useful. I mean, ultimately, all assumptions are false, and you can see that if you collect enough data. Even something that looked perfectly normally distributed with an N of 100. By the time you get to N of 1,000,000, you might see a little heavy tail out here. And so the idea that assumptions are not violated is not that helpful to me. The question is, what is the impact of violating assumptions on what you're trying to do? And a bigger question than that is, if you're thinking that model assumptions are violated, you must have in your mind an alternative approach. Now, some people just like to criticize things without having any alternatives that they offer. But if you're thinking of an alternative, you need to name what it is, and you need to see if the alternative has worse problems than the original model that you were considering. And quite often, the alternatives that people have when they're criticizing your model are worse than what you're doing. You'll hear people say, they don't like the Wilcoxon test and they think you should use a t-test. Well, the t-test is almost always going to be worse than the Wilcoxon test. So that's really a crazy sort of criticism. Often what people are saying when your model assumptions are violated is that your model is too simple and you need to add a lot of complexity into the model. And that might be true, but if your sample size is not very large, adding complexity to the model may make it perform worse. And so that's called the variance bias trade-off. So adding complexity will lower bias, but it may increase variance faster than it lowers the bias. So when something increases instability or variance faster than it improves the bias, you're going to have a net harm by allowing more parameters in the model. So the biggest argument related to this is, a lot of people argue that if you use an ordinal outcome and you use a common odds ratio to express the effect of an X variable, you shouldn't be doing that. You should be estimating as many odds ratios as you have levels of your outcome variable. So it's pretty easy to show, and I have an R function that actually shows this on your own data set, that if you use multiple cutoffs on the outcome variable, you're going to harm the analysis more than you help it. You're going to increase noise, make things unstable, and you're going to predict the future worse unless your original data set is quite large. So the short answer to all that is, when you think your model isn't perfect, just assume that's the case. But if you're going to do something about it, make sure that what you're going to do is not going to make things worse instead of make things better. And often it'll make things worse by going beyond what the sample size allows you to estimate in terms of the number of parameters. So these are key concepts that will come up in many different ways in the course.
Chitu.
There's one thing that I guess Keith has kind of come up implicitly already, and it's an underlying thing.
I think we lost you.
No, I did that by accident. Chitu, I'm sorry. Hold on a second.
Okay, I'm sorry. Okay,
So
one thing I've always struggled with really understanding is the idea of degrees of freedom. So when I've tried to understand it, most explanations basically give a formula of how it's calculated for different kinds of models. But what I'm really lacking is the intuition behind what degrees of freedom mean, not just how to calculate them. I mean, that's simple mathematics, but what are the implications of low degree of freedom or of high degree of freedom? And when does it become bad? When is it acceptable? I mean on an intuitive level. I've never been able to grasp that.
It's a question a lot of people ask, so you're not alone. So this is the glossary of statistical terms, and I tried my best in that glossary. That was a link from the previous page we were on, to define degrees of freedom. And I hope I say this somewhere, but the main idea of degrees of freedom is how many opportunities did things have to predict the outcome? And so just think of parameters. Every time you add a parameter, your R squared is going to go up. So adding a parameter gives you an opportunity to predict the outcome a little better. So how many opportunities did you have to predict the outcome with a higher and higher R squared? That would be the degrees of freedom. So it's formally the number of parameters that you are using to relate to the outcome variable. But you could say it's the number of opportunities for predicting the outcome variable. And then this definition goes into some examples that are more classical sort of examples. This is officially the numerator degrees of freedom that I'm talking about, which is I also call the model degrees of freedom. So numerator, that comes from an F statistic idea in ANOVA. So the model degrees of freedom is more aligned with opportunities. It's a number of parameters currently being considered or tested. So I hope that helps. I don't think that's a perfect definition, but I hope it helps.
I kind of follow what you just explained, but I'm missing what's the implication of that? Why do you want more opportunities to predict? Why do you want less? And even like you recently said that, so if, for example, you have a model, someone's complained that the model is too simple, they want you to add parameters, and adding parameters will reduce degrees of freedom. So it's those implications. I'm trying to say that, okay, how does that one go to another? That's where I get lost. So not just calculating, okay, this has more degrees of freedom or lower, but then so what? Because I get the idea this is related to overfitting, but I don't understand that link.
And some of that I don't think will be understandable until we complete a few sections, especially in chapter 4. But the big picture is increasing the number of parameters is increasing the model degrees of freedom. In ordinary regression, it is decreasing the residual degrees of freedom. So it's decreasing the information effectively for estimating the residual variance. But that's particular linear models, and all the other models like logistic, we don't have residual variance. So we just talk about the model degrees of freedom. Going up is going to be a good thing if it makes you fit better without overfitting. But once the model degrees of freedom goes above a certain level, the fit will seem to be better, but the overfitting is getting to be harmful. So we're sort of looking for a nice tipping point where you explain the patterns in the data that are ones that are going to replicate or reproduce, but you don't over-explain things by fitting too many parameters that the sample size cannot support.
If maybe after a few sessions it will become clearer, I can definitely wait. But
and please come back with more questions, because we're going to aim to cover that more completely.
Okay, thank you.
You've expressed a notion that many other people feel and are uncomfortable with, and will remain uncomfortable with, even with a lot of experience and analysis. With Frank's material and exposition, you'll get to see how to think about it in a different way. But I've never found an explicit explanation or definition that really makes it concrete and clear for me. So I'm just recommending that both we respect the question you've asked, because it's really key and important, but we respect also the kind of discomfort we're going to feel with this topic or this issue for a while. And eventually as you say, you're going to get more comfortable with being uncomfortable with it, and can still use the degrees of freedom effectively while not having an explicit, concrete definition.
Something we're going to get to in just a moment, we'll get into this a little bit also, because if you think about a machine learning technique, you can ask the question that most people forget to ask, which is how many opportunities did that algorithm have to make a good prediction? So if you're using something like random forest or recursive partitioning upon which random forest is built, you may find that it had, in a typical data set, it may have 10,000 opportunities to predict. And then you find out the overfitting was very severe. Once you know how to evaluate overfitting, which most people running random forest don't know how to do. So once you evaluate overfitting, and then you think back to the fact that the random forest had 10,000 opportunities to predict well, and we only had 500 people in the data set, it's not hard to see why there would be overfitting. And so why do I say 10,000 is because it looks at all possible variables and all possible splits on the values of the variable when you dichotomize a predictor. So by the time you look at all possible splits and all possible variables, and you do splits multiple times, there were a lot of opportunities. So it's effectively estimating a lot of parameters. So in the next section, we actually get right into an example like that. But before we get into that, let's look at the big picture. These are the three main uses of models. There's more uses that we'll get to, but these are sort of primary. So we can do hypothesis testing, which is not as much fun as some of the other things. So you can do formal hypothesis tests or formal model comparison using methods such as AIC. So this is where you penalize for the degrees of freedom. So if somebody says your model is too simple, you need to use my complex model, AIC is going to say, is your more complex model actually better for the money? Is it better once you account for the fact that it's more complex? So that is a formal model comparison. You can use models for estimation, which we do a lot. You can get point and interval estimate of one predictor's effect. So what's the effect of raising age from 30 to 40 if you didn't change anything else? That's an estimation problem. Or you can do prediction, which is kind of more general. So that's the estimated outcome or outcome tendency for a subject. So what we're usually interested in prediction is not predicting what an individual subject's blood pressure is, or whether an individual subject is going to die or not. But we're going to predict the tendency for that person to die. We're going to predict their probability of death. So prediction often involves the prediction of the outcome tendency for a subject. And that's something we use a lot. Now, in terms of hypothesis testing, people have all of these statistical tests through history, and then they have non-parametric and permutation tests. These are not as useful for estimation. They're useful for getting p-values, but not as useful for other things. And then if you want to extend them for cluster sampling or longitudinal data, you have a hard time extending some of those methods. So models are a more general way to think about things. And they generalize the common tests. So the two-sample t-test is a special case of ANOVA. ANOVA is nothing more than multiple linear regression using indicator variables instead of continuous predictors. So once you form indicator variables, you can get ANOVA with regular linear regression. So why do we keep teaching ANOVA and t-test in school? It actually takes our minds away from general principles to be teaching all these special cases. Less well known is the Wilcoxon and Kruskal-Wallis rank tests are just special cases of the proportional odds ordinal logistic model. So why not learn that model instead of learning the special cases? Because this extends to longitudinal data, it extends to clustered data, multi-level data, it extends to adjusting for other variables. Whereas in a Wilcoxon test, you cannot adjust for another variable at all easily. The log rank test for survival curves is exactly a special case of the Cox model. So we keep seeing papers published where they said they use both the log rank test and the Cox model in the same paper. Why in the world would you do that? Why would you create confusion for the reader when it's all the same thing? Just use one unified approach. And what's kind of interesting is when you think about models, you can adjust for multiplicity in a fuller way, whereas most statisticians think of multiplicity adjustment as putting a more stringent threshold on a p-value. When you put a more stringent threshold on a p-value because you calculated a lot of p-values and you want to protect yourself from what's called a family-wise error probability, that has nothing to do with correcting the point estimates for multiplicity. So this actually leads to a lot of misinterpretations, especially in clinical trials with subgroups. So when you get a subgroup estimate that survives a multiplicity correction, that subgroup estimate is going to be a bad estimate for that subgroup because you found the subgroup because they had a big treatment effect. And that's going to be a biased estimate. So you really need to correct the treatment effect across the subgroups for multiplicity, just like you need to correct p-values. But it takes a model to correct the point estimates, and most people use a hierarchical or random effects model for correcting the point estimates. For estimation, we have to have a model. So if somebody asked this question, what happens to the hazard of death if you raise your cholesterol from 200 to 250? There's no way to do that without a model. You wouldn't have enough people with a cholesterol of exactly 200 or exactly 250 in your data set to take the subset at those values and then get a hazard ratio for that comparison. Your sample size would not be big enough for that. But we're going to fit a model over the whole range of cholesterol and estimate the model at 2 points. Take the difference and anti-log that, and that'll give us the hazard ratio we need. Then there's adjustments, and we're usually interested in adjusted effects, not so much unadjusted crude or marginal effects. This is one of the biggest debates right now in epidemiology and causal inference, and a lot of people are claiming to be interested in marginal or crude effects because it fits in with causal calculus, but it's not actually what they needed in the first place. It doesn't apply to individual people. So this next section we're going to cover is about classification versus prediction. And this is the big picture that I think is what you need to understand in this section. If your goal is estimation or prediction, your output of your modeling process should be a continuous output. Even if the outcome is dead or alive, the output needs to be the probability of death. We don't want to classify somebody as being dead or alive. That's not helpful, especially if the average risk of death is 0.02. You won't classify anybody as dying because it almost never happens in your sample. So we're not interested in that. We want a continuous output, which would be risk of death. We want to handle close calls and gray zones. So if you're estimating somebody's blood pressure after treatment, you're going to use the complete continuous distribution of blood pressure. Whereas if you tried to make it a classification like down here, and you said, let's classify someone about whether their blood pressure was less than 130. If somebody's blood pressure was 131, you would say they're a total failure. And a 131 is counted the same as a 160. A 131 is counted as horrible, and a 129 is counted as wonderful. So you can see that that doesn't handle close calls and gray zones. The net effect of this is that when you're analyzing the data, your effective sample size is much reduced when you're not able to handle gray zones and close calls. A continuous output is also the input you need to give to a decision maker. You wouldn't say, well, your patient is going to die. That's not going to help the decision maker as much as saying the probability the patient's going to die is 0.1. So prediction is consistent with the output that a decision maker needs to get. So a poker player who's looking at the cards is estimating the probability she's going to win the hand of poker. The poker players who win do not say to themselves, I'm going to win or I'm going to lose. They actually estimate the probabilities based on what they know about the hand. Classification gives you a categorical output. It hides close calls, so it loses information. And it creates a lot of noise. So that blood pressure of 131 versus 129, those two are very close to each other. But a classification is going to say one was a success, one was a total failure. You make premature decisions with classification because to make a decision, you cannot make a decision without knowing the consequences of a decision, which is called the utility or loss or cost function. So you can't make a good decision without a utility or cost function, loss function. And so when you classify somebody as dead or alive or stroke or not, you're actually making a premature decision for the decision maker. And your decision is devoid of the utility function that you really need to make the decision. You need to know the consequences of the decision before you can make a valid decision. Classification does not provide sufficient input to the decision maker, but it is useful for quick, easy decisions, such as recognizing letters of the alphabet. You're doing visual pattern recognition and you want it quick. Is this a letter K or not? So that's when classification can be useful. And the other way of saying it is classification is useful when the outcome probabilities are all near 0 or 1. So if things are easy, so that there's not a gray zone, somebody's either going to die with a risk of 1 or they're going to live with a probability of 1. So in that situation, classification is going to work fine because there are not any close calls. But classification runs into big problems if these probabilities are not all really small or really large. So this blog that it's related to the one that Drew put up. This is my most popular blog article of all time. And a lot of machine learning folks have discovered that and are reading it. And I'm very glad because they were making this mistake left and right and still make it today. So understand there is a huge difference between prediction and classification. And it's very uncommon that classification is the goal, the ultimate goal. The idea of classification comes into play maybe if you're making instant decisions like in a self-driving car. Is that thing in front of you a stop sign, yes or no? That self-driving car has to make a very quick decision about whether to stop or not. So that might be a place for classification. But in most of the things that we see in real data, it's about prediction and estimation. Any questions about classification?
Chidu has had his hand up for a long time, and then I think
Go ahead.
Marilyn had her hand up.
Let someone else ask a question first.
Marta?
Hi, I got a bit confused with what you said. When you talk about prediction and classification, do you mean the types of the models that are used for classification or prediction? So I'll give the example maybe to make it easier. So you've got the data where there are different predictors and the outcome is the child was or wasn't vaccinated. And maybe the predictors are ethnicity and, well, other predictors. You would use the classification model, and I personally would be interested in inference. So not really on the unit level, but of the risk factors. And I don't know how to apply what you've just said. So is it the right model? For example, logistic regression, isn't it? I would assume it is. I
Yeah,
just got a
it's
bit confused.
super question, Marta. So logistic regression would be a wonderful model for that. And logistic regression is not a classification model. So this is really a naming, it's a naming convention. So what people are made the mistake in machine learning is to call something classification when you're not classifying something. So whenever you say classification, that means what you're doing is classifying, and you're not doing that with logistic regression. So logistic
Sorry, I got
regression,
confused.
logistic regression is all about modeling tendencies. It's not about classification at all. So what by modeling a tendency means what's your probability of getting a vaccination? So this is just a naming problem. So a classification would be like a simple machine learning classifier that only gives two outputs to the machine. The machine never gave you a probability of 0.5 or vaccination. It said, this child's going to be vaccinated or not. That's a classifier. So a lot of people are using the wrong words.
Oh,
Classification
sorry,
isn't.
it was me.
No, you're not alone. You're in the majority. The majority of people are misusing the term. So just think about logistic regression is a probability model. In other words, you're estimating tendencies. It's not a classification model.
Thank you. Sorry for that.
No, it's a very common thing. Very common.
The classification tree models are a more classical representation of a classifier.
Yeah, in recursive partitioning, there's a regression tree which will come up with continuous outputs. And there's a classification tree that will come up with a classification. It'll say, if you're in this branch of the tree, you're a dead man. So that's the difference.
Tito, do you want to ask a question now?
Yes, I hope this is a simple question, but like in the charts that Frank, you showed just a moment ago, you had the terminology estimation or prediction, and I use those contrasts in a very interesting way. I would just like calibration to know if I'm using them the same way as you. For me, estimation is when you have a model where the y is basically at the same time frame as the x-axis, whereas prediction is where the y is at a future time from the x-axis. And that's a distinction I make when I use the term estimation or prediction. Do you have a more precise or different distinction when you use those terms?
I tend to not use that, although it makes total sense. What I use instead is, are we trying to unveil current unknown status of someone? Or are we trying to predict the future that we don't know? So the idea of unveiling the current status in medicine, that would be called a diagnostic model. So the patient already has the disease. It's hidden to you. You're trying to unveil it. And so we're going to get the probability that they have a hidden disease. So that is one of your cases where the data are all measured at the same time, but part of the data are not currently revealed to you in how you use the model.
Okay.
So
I
I usually get into that at another point, but it is an important distinction. But the way that I think about estimation and prediction is simpler than that. It's just estimation. There's a lot of things you could estimate: mean blood pressure, risk of a stroke, risk of death. Those could be called prediction or estimation. It doesn't really matter. The difference with estimation is often estimation involves estimating a difference. So we want to know, what is your estimated reduction in blood pressure if you were on treatment B versus treatment A and you were 30 years old. So that would be a contrast or an estimated difference. So estimation sort of includes prediction, but it's kind of more general too, because it can be estimating differences. Whereas prediction, we're kind of predicting something that's not subtracted.
I want to recommend Frank's book, because he really does a good job in his book about defining these things and contrasting these things. This question you raised is also related to what James has asked in the chat as well. In general, epidemiologists will think about estimation as coming up with the process of estimation of trying to characterize the magnitude of an association or effect, a causal effect. How strong is a relationship? How strong is the relationship between a beta or a covariate and an outcome? Whereas prediction would be, in future observations, have you accurately, is your y hat close to the actual observed outcome in future observations. So Frank's book does a terrific job of really characterizing this more clearly. I want to recommend his book. And but I think estimation in general is referring to describing a point estimate, confidence interval, or a Bayesian distribution for a beta, focusing on that as the measure of scientific interest, whereas prediction is something like getting the other side of the equation, the left-hand side of the equation right, correct.
I think that's a
Accurate.
better way to say what I'm about to say. So when you're doing a diagnostic model in medicine, you could say, and it's commonly said, I'm predicting the probability somebody has a disease. So prediction there doesn't mean predicting the future. It means predicting the current state. It's just that you don't know the current state. So whether you want to call that prediction or not, you could debate that either way. I would say the more accurate way to say it is estimating the probability that the person currently has disease that we don't know about.
James, does that help your question? Does that help you in your question?
Yeah, that was pretty similar to kind of what I've heard in my world. I just remember having a professor once who was very adamant about not, he didn't really want to use the word prediction ever unless you were actually predicting something that wasn't there. So that's kind of where my line of thinking had been in relation to this discussion, but that's super helpful. Thank you.
There's
Yeah,
enormous overlap that can't be avoided. And what Frank's book and Frank's methods point out is that if you're going to do a good job of prediction, you've got to do a good job of estimation, and sort of vice versa. And so those two things are, intimately confounded, but they represent different scientific interests or focuses.
Well, one of the ways to see how, the most important distinction to make is classification versus estimation or prediction. So classification is just a drastically different idea that's very seldom useful, even in marketing and business. But one of the ways to find out how much damage has been done by this misunderstanding is that people that are doing classification, when your data starts out unbalanced, they will use a method to balance the data. So you might have 100 customers bought a product and 10,000 did not buy the product. So they'll take some kind of random sample of those that did not buy the product. So you have 100 versus 100, and which I think is called SMOT or something. And so then they'll do a classifier that's easier to do with the balanced data. And then they'll wonder why the classifier completely fails when they apply it to future customers. So their classifier works if the future customers come to you in such a way that half of them are going to buy the product. But you already know from your data that only 100 out of 1,000 or 10,000 bought the product. So you've got it totally miscalculated, and it doesn't apply to any future customers. And then they go through all these messes to rebalance, to unbalance the classifier. And all they're doing is like driving a car down the street and you want to make a right turn. And instead of that, you do 3 left turns. So you'll end up at the same place if you make 3 left turns, but why in the world would you do it? So anytime something's imbalanced, it means already that classification is an improper goal. So something that's rare, the best you can do is describe the tendency for it to happen. And that's going to be a probability. And a lot of your probabilities are going to be between 0 and 0.01 for a rare event, and there's nothing wrong with that. So classification has misled countless researchers. The next section is choice of the model. This is where things get too subjective, and we should do better. And we tend to fall back on choosing a model, not because of some underlying principles, but because it has the right mathematical structure. So can that model generate data that's like yours? So if it's a model for a probability, it should not generate probabilities that are greater than 1 or less than 0. So if your outcome is going to be a probability, your model needs to come up with things between 0 and 1. We do find in medical outcomes that sometimes specific models work for acute diseases and different models like the Cox proportional hazards model works for chronic diseases. So acute diseases tend to be modeled better with a accelerated failure time model, and chronic diseases more with a constant hazard ratio sort of Cox model. So that gives us a little bit of guidance, but we don't have enough guidance for the choice of the model. But we do really look at this one a lot. Robust models are better. So a model that uses all the information in the data but doesn't assume a whole lot is going to often be better. So the Cox proportional hazards model doesn't assume that you properly transformed your time variable, your outcome variable. So it's going to give you the same regression coefficients no matter how you transform your outcome variable. And that's a real plus. So that makes it more robust. And that's true of ordinal models in general. Now, in terms of the next thing, this will relate to so many things in the course. And there's different philosophies you can take about model specification. So how are you going to specify or select a model? Well, it might be totally pre-specified. So we're going to try to specify a model that's flexible enough to fit the data. So we don't want to oversimplify the model. And then the fit might be assumed to be adequate. It doesn't need to be perfect, but it needs to be good as any model that doesn't require a larger sample size. This is another way of trying to say something I said earlier, and I think this is a key statement. Your model is not going to be perfect. It will not be as good as another model that has the luxury of being fit on a much bigger sample size, because then you can have more parameters and you can have less bias. But your model needs to be as good as any model that doesn't require a larger sample size than what you have. And that's really a key test of a model. So when these things are true, there's not going to be any model uncertainty, and you're going to get accurate statistical inference, such as confidence intervals being what they claim to be as, say, 95% intervals. Now, another way to do model specification is pre-specify a Bayesian model, but you have more parameters in it. And so you think of the ways the model could go wrong, such as non-normality or non-equal variance. For everything that could go wrong that you might be worried about, you add a parameter to the model. And the reason that doesn't always require a bigger sample size is you don't add these parameters without restriction. You have a prior distribution on them. So your prior distribution might say that by default, we're going to assume normality. So our prior distribution on the amount of non-normality is going to favor normality. As the data set gets a little bigger, we'll allow it to be very non-normal. But if the data set's too small to know anything, we're going to put a bias in the model to make it assume the data have more of a normal distribution. When the data set is small, we're going to be favoring equal variance in a 2-sample t-test. But as the data set gets bigger, we'll relax that assumption. So that's done with prior distributions. The great thing about this is it doesn't require binary model choices. So you don't say, we're going to change models if it's not normal. We're going to transform the dependent variable if it's not normal. You don't say that. So anytime you can have a continuous process is going to work better than a process that has discontinuities in it. If you have to jump to another model, things tend to go wrong. So when you do it like this, you're going to get accurate Bayesian posterior distributions. It's going to be robust, and it's also going to give you insights about non-normality, non-equal variance, whatever it is you care about. Now, you could have in your model selection, you could have a contest. And if your contest involves 2 models, you're actually not cheating hardly at all. So what does that mean? You have your desired model that might be simple, and then you have a more general model, and it's more general because it allows interactions and nonlinearities. So it might be a model that for some reason or other, you hope you don't need. And so you contrast the model that's simple with the more general model and see if the more general model is better for the money. And that might be using Akaike's information criterion AIC, which we'll get a little bit more into. So to me, this is a better way to check goodness of fit. I'm not going to say, is my model fitting, yes or no? I'm going to say, is an alternative model that can only fit better actually worse? So if an alternative model that can only fit better because it's a superset of the original model, it has all the original parameters and more. So it can only fit better. If the more general model actually is worse, we are going to feel really good about our simple model. So it could be worse because the R squared went up, but the adjusted R squared went down. The chi-square went up, but it didn't go up by more than twice the degrees of freedom, which is AIC. So when you have a contest between two models, you have minimal model uncertainty. You have minimal damage. And to me, this is better than a usual goodness of fit assessment. The empirical approach, if you have more than two pre-specified models, so the extreme of this would be stepwise variable selection. So with stepwise variable selection, you might look at 1,000 models. By the time you look at more than 2 or 3 models, the process is highly unstable and you get very distorted statistical inference. The first thing that goes bad is the standard errors of your parameter estimates. And that means your confidence intervals are all going to be too narrow. Standard errors are going to be too small because they don't take into account all of this instability. So this is when you worry so much by this empirical process of not thinking about it and at least ruling it down to 2 or 3 models. If you leave it wide open and you're just going to be empirical, like doing stepwise regression, everything gets badly distorted. Machine learning takes this to the extreme, and it can be highly unstable unless N is very, very large. And you don't get statistical inference typically. So if you tried a lot of models, let's say more than 3, your standard errors, if you take the model that seems to fit the best, or the one that has smallest p-values, your standard errors are going to be too small, confidence limits are too narrow, p-values are too small, R-squareds are too big. So the model that you end with, if you analyze it as if it's the model you started with, all of the statistical quantities can be drastically wrong. It will be over-optimistic. Stepwise regression is one of the worst problems. Now, you can use the bootstrap to repeat all the steps to penalize everything for the uncertainty. And so if you go to that trouble of doing 300 bootstrap resamples of your data, and you reanalyzed it 300 times from 0, and you allowed everything to be objectively chosen, you can use the bootstrap to get valid confidence intervals and standard errors doing it that way. But the bootstrap has to have access to all of the thought process that you used in choosing a model. And it has to do all these analyses independently. Now, this paper by Yi is a really good way to think about these issues. So Yi developed generalized degrees of freedom for any data mining procedure that's based on minimizing the sum of squared errors. And so Yi gave this wonderful example where you have 20 candidate predictors on 22 people, and you do a forward stepwise and find the best 5 variable model. So the best 5 variable model, the vast majority of people in the world analyze this as if it's got 5 variables in it. If you run SPSS calls this automatic regression. And it's one of the worst things they could have ever put on a menu. If you use the generalized degrees of freedom, you see that the effect of modeling 5 variables at the end has the same stability as if you pre-specified a model with 14 variables and that model was fitted on 22 observations. 14 is the number such that when you take the sum of squared residuals and you divide it by n minus 14 minus 1, you get an unbiased estimate of the residual variance. So this is telling you about the effective number of parameters you have in a model. You have 5 parameters you're looking at. You have 9 phantom parameters. These are phantom degrees of freedom. So the actual degrees of freedom here is 14, which is closer to 20 than to 5. So you had a lot of degrees of freedom in that analysis because you had more than 20 opportunities to predict because there were more than 20 models examined. If you did recursive partitioning or classification and regression tree with 10 candidate predictors on 100 subjects, and the tree found 19 nodes. So it does this, it's like it divides into age less than 65 versus greater than 65. Then you divide the one age group into male, female, and you keep dividing it till you get these terminal nodes. So you have at the lower branches, you have 19 terminal nodes. The generalized degrees of freedom, the stability of this tree is the same as pre-specifying a multiple regression model with 76 parameters in it. Now, nobody would pre-specify a model with 76 parameters with 100 subjects unless you're in genetics. They do it all the time. But outside that, people wouldn't do it, but they do it with CART all the time without knowing it. So this is your effective number of degrees of freedom that you put in the analysis. Very unstable, very dangerous, and nobody will ever replicate what you did. You get a new sample of 100 people and you fit this tree, it won't look anything like this tree that you developed. So that has to do with this high degree of instability here.
Frank,
Yes.
Pedro's had his hand up for a long time, as has Cheeto. But before we get to Pedro's question, I think in hearing your exposition about this, there's something that needs to be reinforced so that people understand what you've been saying. When all of us had introductory stats courses, and even later, much later in our graduate courses, we were taught methods in which that assumed that the analysis you were entertaining had no uncertainty about the variables to be included. That's all predicated on Fisher and agricultural experiments and knowing what all the relevant variables were, and that was built into the design, and therefore that was how you structured your analysis. And because you knew all the relevant variables and set your analysis up that way based on that, your standard errors and your p-values all had the right operating characteristics. They all the right, alphas, et cetera. That's all based on sort of the concept of a designed experiment analysis. And that's where statistics started. And but then the genie got out of the box, right? And we started applying statistics in situations where we had less certainty about what the relevant variables are. We don't know what the relevant variables are. We're trying to use the data to divine what the relevant variables are. And that's when things get confused and awkward. And that's where all of what Frank is talking about now becomes relevant. How do we navigate when we're uncertain about what the relevant variables are and what the model is and how to estimate certain things of interest? So that background is sort of important, I think, to understand this tree and the subtleties and nuances of what Frank has just been trying to elaborate on. Pedro, you've been very patient. What can we answer for you?
Sure. Hi. Thanks, Drew. Hi, Frank.
Hi.
So I actually have two questions. The first one is regarding sample size calculation. So Richard Riley and colleagues have done a fantastic work on giving different closed formulas for the sample size calculation, right? In logistic regression, cost regression, so on and so forth. However, for machine learning, there's a paper by Steyerberg that says machine learning is data hungry. And they say approximately 100 candidates, but there's really no formal calculation, right? I mean, are you aware of any paper out there or any package in R allowing you to perform a formal sample size calculation?
No, we go by we'll refer to that Steyerberg paper today, I believe, or tomorrow. That gives you a good rough guidance of 200 events per candidate feature. So if you had 1,000 candidate features, that would be 200,000 sample size. That's 200,000 events, which might take 1 million people. So that's the only thing I know about. I'm sure there's more out there, but it's basically take the sample size you need with statistical models and sort of multiply it by 10 or so.
Okay, because the problem is that machine learning is like the Wild West, right? There are no rules, and many times when you try to, or as a reviewer, you ask for a sample size calculation, it's not provided many times. So I was interested on that.
Anytime you see people use a method for which no sample size calculation was done, you can be on your guard. And so another example of that is people are doing personalized medicine and they're trying to find subgroups in which the treatment works. This is ridiculous because the overall sample is usually not big enough to estimate the average treatment effect. And if it's not big enough to estimate the average treatment effect, it's sure not going to be big enough to estimate the effect in a small subgroup. So it's futile what's being done in most cases. So, and they never bother to show you a sample size calculation for personalized medicine or treatment effect heterogeneity. Since they're never willing to be on record with how embarrassing it is that the sample size for doing what they're doing on the clinical trial is 10 times the sample size of the original trial.
Yes. Thank you for that. And the second question is, you were discussing very quickly. The second question is, you were discussing previously about choice of the model, acute versus chronic, right? So acute, more accelerated failure time models, while chronic, more cost regression. I wanted to ask you regarding flexible parametric modeling, mainly the Royston-Parmar model. As I personally find it a very attractive way to not assume any baseline hazard distribution and with splines just let it. And also the second is the proportional assumptions, right? And in the book and in the course, you are always talking about assumptions, try to relax all assumptions, relax the linearity assumption, for instance. However, the proportional assumptions in the Cox model is something that everybody assumes. And I wanted to ask you regarding relaxing the proportional assumption with a time interaction. And what were your thoughts about it?
Yeah, that fits into this box here. And, you know, these flexible parametric survival models can always be used in place of the Cox model, and they're going to work super. And the best reference for that is the RSTAN ARM survival system using the STAN Bayesian modeling system with R. So they have this incredible package of flexible parametric survival models with Bayesian solutions. So the idea is, with regard to proportional hazards, you add a non-proportional hazards parameter. And if you put no prior distribution on it, or let's say a flat prior, then you're going to need a big sample size. And if you put a prior on it that favors proportional hazards but doesn't require it, you're going to have the most logical way to model that. So people have written papers about, like, you have a spline function of time that interacts with treatment, and you could put Bayesian priors on that, so it doesn't get overly complex for the sample size.
Do you have this option in your RMSB package?
RMSB has an option, that exact option, with regard to the ordinal models that it implements. That's called constrained partial proportional odds model, just like you could have a partial proportional hazards model.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
I think, Pedro, we recognize you as an alumni from past courses. Is that correct?
Yes, it's my 4th year.
Wow. Thank you, Pedro.
welcome
Thank
you
you for
back.
coming. That's wonderful.
And there's other students here that I've already recommended the course. They're attending this year too.
Great.
And Chito, you've been patient.
Is there a hand up from Liviu?
Yeah.
So whoever was next.
Let Liviu go first. I've been asking a lot of questions, so let everyone else ask before I do things.
Thank you. Hi. Regarding machine learning, I typically tend to think of machine learning methods as extreme overfitting techniques. Is this a fair characterization?
To me, it's very fair, and the worst I've ever seen has come from random forest. And the people that use it a lot don't see it as a problem because they don't measure overfitting. So anytime you're going to bury your head in the sand, you're not going to see problems. And the first question you ask someone that says their machine learning method doesn't overfit is, what kind of calibration curves do you plot? And the answer I get to that is, cal what? They don't even know what a calibration curve is. So if you don't know what a calibration curve is, you're not going to know anything about overfitting, and the method's going to seem to work great. So there's a lot of head in the sand practice in the machine learning world. And I've seen overfitting with random forest that beats anything I've ever seen, where, like, the C index is 0.84 or less, and it gets a 0.94 out of the same data. It's just not possible. And then you look at the calibration curve, and it looks like something that's from a train wreck. So I'm glad you brought that up, Pedro. I mean, Liviu. Chito.
Yes, thank you. So the chart that you have on the screen right now, one point that is repeated a few times on the leaf notes is no model uncertainty or minimal model uncertainty. I don't quite understand what that term is, but it seems very essential to what that chart is trying to get at. Well, what's the idea of model uncertainty versus model certainty, the decisions in this tree?
Yeah, this would be like, if this 14 were equal to 5, you would say there's not really any hidden model uncertainty. If this 76 were equal to 19, you would say there's no phantom degrees of freedom or model uncertainty. Another way to say it is, if you were to calculate the standard error of some estimate from this procedure here in the final model, and you were to bootstrap the whole process, and the bootstrap usually finds the same variables, and it comes up with the same overall standard error for that effect, you would say there's no model uncertainty. If you get a standard error for a certain estimate from this model of 0.03, and the bootstrap says it's 0.3, it's 10 times bigger, then you have tremendous model uncertainty. So if the bootstrap, taking into account model uncertainty, in other words, you're finding possibly different 5 variables for every sample. And if you get different 5 variables and you get an overall standard error that's 10 times bigger, then you know that there was hidden model uncertainty in this one with its small standard error of the estimate.
Okay, so if I understand correctly, the idea of model uncertainty is you run the analysis once and okay, it's a mathematical procedure. It gives you numbers, it gives you fit, it gives you certain parameters, it gives you p-values, but then you change the data a little bit and you get different numbers, different parameters, and so on, then you are uncertain which model is correct.
Yes.
But a procedure with minimal or low model uncertainty, you run it once, you change the data a little bit, it gives you substantially the same results. You run it 5 times, substantially the same results. That's what you want. That is, so whichever of those 5 versions that are almost the same that you pick, it's about the same thing. You don't have much model uncertainty. Is that the idea?
That's right. Yeah, you can look at it in terms of instability caused by selecting different samples. You could think of it in terms of if you leave out one person from the data set, do you change your estimates a lot? So you would find that this one will fail the test. If you leave out one of these 22 people and look at your regression coefficients, you'll find they change a lot.
Okay.
So that's an extreme case because that's so small.
Now, I'm understanding the intuition. I still don't understand what degrees of freedom mean in that in that paragraph, i.e. But I understand the intuition of what you just explained, but I don't understand how that maps to. I still don't understand how to map that to degrees of freedom. But I'm getting there. I'm getting there. I think as
it's a
it
hard
progresses, it'll become clearer.
So just keep in mind, one way to interpret it is pre-specifying a model with 14 X's, and you name which X's they are. So it's totally pre-specified. And then you get sigma squared, you get all the quantities from that model. And the way that model performs and how wide the confidence intervals are is going to be the same characteristics as this process. So this process seemed to be simple.
Okay.
But the true volatility of this process, once you account for the fact that the variables may change when somebody walks into a room, it's going to give the volatility of this if you pre-specified it, but you had 14 variables in it. So this process has 5 degrees of freedom in front of you and 9 degrees of freedom that are phantom degrees of freedom haunting the analysis for a total of 14 degrees of freedom.
So in other words, if I understand right, if you had specified 14 variables, that gives a certain stability of results. Yeah. And we're hoping that with just 5 variables, we could get a simpler model that is stable. And with this procedure, we think we have that. But actually, in order to get the same stability that the 5 variables are pretending to give us, we'd actually need 14 variables. Because if we change some data, those 5 variables will give something else.
Instead of saying you need 14 variables, you would say that this process is just as terrible as if you had started with 14 variables and did not do stepwise regression.
So that this part of intuition I'm having trouble with. What is wrong with starting with 14 variables in this context? Why is that a bad thing?
So if you went through the Richard Riley paper or did a sample size calculation, if you had 14 variables to start with, the sample size you would find that you need is going to be dependent on the true R squared. But let's say the true R squared is not that big. The sample size you need might be 10 times this.
Gotcha. Okay. So in other words, I'm thinking because it's only 5 variables, maybe I can get by with 22, but actually it's as inadequate as if I had used 14 variables with just 22.
You got it.
Okay. That's okay. Thank you.
Well put.
I'm getting there.
Okay, let's take about a 10-minute break. These questions are so fantastic, so keep it up. I'll see you back in about 10 minutes. Okay, I'm assuming everybody can see this little whiteboard from Zoom. And I tried to depict something that may help with this degrees of freedom question, and it has to do with stepwise regression too. And so that's ANOVA. And so I put up there 5 different treatment means. So let's say we have treatments A, B, C, D, E, and you see that in your observed treatment means B and C are close together and D and E are close together. So you observe that and you decide to combine these two. So now you bring forward this, and this. So you start off, your ANOVA is going to have 4 degrees of freedom in the numerator. So that's an ANOVA, which is your model degrees of freedom. So there's 4 unique differences. We'll describe 5, all possible differences between 5 treatments. So your model is going to have an intercept and 4 indicator or dummy variables in it. And if you do an F-test, you're going to get an F-test with 4 and something degrees of freedom. And that F-test is going to have a perfect multiplicity adjustment in it. Absolutely perfect. So it's taken into account that you had 4 opportunities to find differences among 5 things. Now, if you look at the combination, though, if you take that forward and say, well, these seem to be similar, and we carry it forward now, we're going to do an ANOVA which has 2 degrees of freedom, and it's going to have more degrees of freedom in the denominator. So now there's 3 groups. 2 of the groups are defined by the combination of 2 other groups. And the comparison you get is going to be invalid with regard to alpha. Your p-value is going to be too small because you have combined groups that apparently were most similar to each other. You've stacked the deck in your favor. If you were to have 4 indicator variables and you did stepwise regression to select the variables, stepwise regression is going to do that pooling that you see here. And it's going to end up with a model that has 2 indicator variables in it plus the intercept. And so this is an analogy to those other examples we were giving where you really have 4 degrees of freedom. And if you pool the data as if you were doing stepwise regression on these indicator variables, you pulled it down to 3 groups instead of 5 groups. You have 2 degrees of freedom apparently, but those are not counting the other 2 phantom degrees of freedom. So I'm hoping this example will help motivate some of these issues where people are having trouble, rightfully so, with the idea of degrees of freedom. And if you did your final analysis with 3 groups, as if those 3 groups were completely pre-specified, you're going to get the wrong statistical inference. Any questions about that way of looking at it? Does that sound good?
I'm sorry, I followed what you said, but it's still not totally clear. But I think, as you said, that there's a lot coming on in this course. I probably need more of what you're going to present, and because with the explanations you've been given so far, it is becoming clearer. But yeah,
Good. Stick with it. Yeah, I think it'll keep getting a little more clear.
I'm here for the long haul.
So yeah, good. Stick with it.
It's sort of like, people use degrees of freedom all the time without thinking about it and getting hung up on it. That doesn't mean that they're using them correctly. The issues Frank is raising is sort of like a cone, like the sound of one hand clapping. If you focus on it too hard, you're going to get stuck. But eventually it's going to come to you. So be patient. And by Friday, I bet you're going to have an intuition that makes you more comfortable.
Thank you.
I don't know if this will help any, but we speak about investigator degrees of freedom, and Andrew Gelman talks about the garden of forking paths, which has to do with how many opportunities someone has to find so-called significant results. So just think about another setting where you have 2 treatments, but you have 5 possible outcome variables. So you can compare treatment A and B with regard to reducing the risk of death, the risk of stroke, the risk of heart attack. You got 5 different outcomes. So in that case, you have 5 investigator degrees of freedom. So the degrees of freedom are coming in a more general sense from the left-hand side of the model where the dependent variables are. You have 5 investigator degrees of freedom. You had 5 opportunities to say this drug is good, because you would say it's good if it lowered mortality or stroke or heart attack or whatever. On the right-hand side of the model is just an indicator for being in treatment B versus treatment A, but it's still 5 investigator degrees of freedom because it's 5 opportunities. But everything we talk about the rest of this course is really the X degrees of freedom, where I was just talking then about the Y degrees of freedom on the outcome variable. We're talking about degrees of freedom on the X space, which is the predictors.